Dr. Chamberlain, Dr. Kathleen Chamberlain, for some list of her honors. I was having trouble finding a list myself, not being real good with websites and so forth. And she said, oh, just say that she's been teaching at Emory and Henry since 1989. But that's not anything part of the story. She is from Cleveland, a very, very ardent fan of the Reds. Indians. Indians. Whoops. I asked Robin. And she got her higher degree from North Carolina, UNC, and she has been teaching at Emory and Henry since 1989. And she has won one of the 6 state-level teacher awards, Teacher of the Year awards. She's a real favorite, even though she's not very easy, I hear from the students at all. Her field includes Jane Austen, one of her favorite authors. She is not only proficient at teaching, but she has shown herself very capable of administration and at drama. When she is in a play, the favorite roles I've seen are those that showcase her arch wit, which I think comes from Jane Austen. More recently, she's very interested in popular culture, particularly old movies, TV shows, and children's books, and she's published articles on Lizzie Borden, The Three Stooges, Star Trek, and Nancy Drew. And she will be going next month to the Popular Culture National Conference in Boston, talking about girls' series books, about which she is girls' series books, particularly in the first half of the 20th century, about which she is probably a national, if not international, expert. And so there's a lot to talk about with Dr. Chamberlain. She's very, very thoughtful, and I'm sure that you'll enjoy her speech about atheism in America.
As Suzanne mentioned, I've been teaching at Emory and Henry since 1989. I've actually been teaching, I shouldn't probably admit this, since 1979, which means that I'm not really capable of speaking at all unless there's a quiz first. But don't worry, it's multiple choice. You can guess. Okay. Who said the following? No, I don't know that atheists should be considered as citizens, nor should they be considered patriots. This is one nation under God. The answer is B, George Bush the First. This comment was supposedly made during a press conference at O'Hare Airport during the presidential campaign of 1987. It was reported by Robert Sherman, the principal reporter for a journal called American Atheist. Now, some people have challenged this report. I tried to track it down on the internet. Some challenge Bush as having said it. He never denied it, but he never said he said it either. Sherman did not tape it, but has stood by his story. But I leave you to decide. It doesn't sound impossible to me. In a poll taken just last month, what percentage of the American population said they would not vote for an atheist for president? D, 53%. The actual full Gallup question read as follows. Between now and the 2008 political conventions, there will be discussions about the qualifications of presidential candidates, their age, race, religion, and so on. If your party nominated a generally well-qualified person for president who happened to be blank, would you vote for that person? And of all the respondents, more people were willing to vote for Muslims and homosexuals, other reviled groups in the country, than were willing to vote for atheists. When it was broken down by political categories, 67% of self-identified liberals were willing to vote for an atheist, as opposed to only 29% of self-identified conservatives. In a 2006 survey conducted by the University of Minnesota, respondents were asked to agree or disagree with this statement. I would disapprove if my child wanted to marry a member of this group. And then a list of groups followed. Percentage of respondents saying disapprove of their child marrying an atheist? D, nearly 50%. This study that the University of Minnesota conducted of 2,000 U.S. households essentially found that atheists were the most distrusted minority in the United States. The higher one's level of education and exposure to diversity, the higher one's tolerance of atheists. But when asked to identify the group that does not agree at all with your vision of American society, over 40% said atheists, a higher percentage than all other answers, including all other groups that you might think would be held in disesteem by the community. So these answers give you some idea of the current status of atheists in America. The sociologists who conducted the Minnesota study concluded that atheists, quote, play the role that Catholics, Jews, and communists have played in the past, in that atheists provide a symbolic moral boundary to membership in American society. The report further states, what matters for public acceptance of atheists, and figures strongly into private acceptance as well, are beliefs about the appropriate relationship between church and state, and about religion's role in underpinning society's moral order. The study found that conservative Protestants especially rejected the possibility of a secular basis for a good society. And the report's authors speculate that this fact, people's belief that religion is essential for a moral society, may be their main reason for placing non-believers outside the American cultural mainstream. So to many of our fellow citizens, atheists are something like this. This is your stereotype of the atheist. A slavering, evil-looking man saying, "There is no God," to sobbing school children. Okay. Atheists are scary, dogmatic, and immoral, threatening the very foundation of our civilization, people as dangerous to school children as any drug pusher hanging around the playground. And even those people who don't see atheists as slavering propagandists of evil are still wary of non-believers. So that's why most of us keep our views to ourselves. It's too risky to be open, especially if you're a public figure or somebody who works with children. Saying that you're a non-believer today is akin to admitting to being a communist in the 1950s. In many ways, you risk less coming out today as a gay person than you do coming out as an atheist or even as an agnostic. If you look at all our politicians, I can't think of a single candidate running for state or national office recently who has not been careful to go on record as a practicing believer. Even to raise issues of belief and non-belief or to ask questions about the dominance of religion in our current society can be political suicide. Yet given our current global situation, we can't afford to have questions about religion and belief taken off the table as legitimate areas of discussion. So I want to make the world safe for non-believers again. And to that end, I thought I'd talk today just about what atheism is, what non-belief is, some of the philosophical issues, and address some of the common myths surrounding these viewpoints. And I'm not unaware of the irony of my addressing these remarks to you. I almost said that I would be preaching to the converted, except that if I said that, I would be doing one of the things that I most try to avoid when talking about non-belief, and that is addressing non-belief in religious terms. And I find this approach problematic because it seems to me to be a sort of question-begging, conceptualizing the whole debate in the very terms that we need to be examining. So what I mean is, regardless of your personal beliefs about the existence of divine beings, I know that you're not among those people who demonize non-believers. But still, I hope you will find it useful to examine some of the common questions that are often asked of atheists. I don't have any final answers. These are complex questions. There are other possible responses. But I thought I would start by playing two roles, questioner and questionee. This is the questioner hat. The questionee is not going to wear a hat because she's dealing with the absence of belief. So the absence of the hat equals absence of belief. Okay. So I mentioned terminology a minute ago, and now I'd like to start with some definitions. Questioner says, just what is an atheist anyway, and an agnostic? And are there any semantic or conceptual difficulties with these categories? Start with atheist. On its simplest level, of course, an atheist is an atheist, non-theist, the opposite of a theist, the way asexual is the opposite of sexual. A theist accepts the existence of a divine being or beings, an atheist does not. But the issue can be a lot more complicated than this simple description suggests. Some people define atheism as the denial of existence of gods. Others define it as the absence of belief. The first definition is positive in that it makes a direct assertion there are no divine beings. The second is negative in that it merely states the absence of something, in this case, the absence of a belief. I want to stress that the terms positive and negative in this sense don't imply any value judgment. It's just presence and absence. But that would lead the questioner to say, but aren't we just then discussing the difference between atheists and agnostics? I thought undecided people were called agnostics and not atheists. Well, according to the Oxford English Dictionary, the term agnostic was first used in 1870 to distinguish between people who said God does not exist and those who said, I don't know if God exists. And I should point out that throughout this talk, I'm just going to say God for convenience. But I don't mean necessarily only the Judeo-Christian God. I mean any divine being or beings, but it's easier just to say God than to keep saying divine being or beings. So anyway, traditionally, philosophers see theists and atheists as people who make metaphysical claims. They say God exists, or they say God does not exist. Those are truth claims. They can be true or false, and they need to be demonstrated. Whereas the agnostic makes an epistemological claim. It says, I don't know if God exists. The metaphysical claims, that is, as I said, are truth claims. They can be demonstrated. They are either true or false. Whereas the epistemological claim deals with how we know whether something is true or false, rather than asserting the truth or falsity, questions how we come to that conclusion. And this is an important distinction, I think. But the questioner might say, well, why are you raising this issue? Is there some kind of problem with the terms atheist and agnostic? And philosophically speaking, I would say not necessarily. Philosophers need carefully defined terms, and the definitions I just provided give a reasonable understanding of what we mean in the discussion of atheist, theist, and agnostic. But culturally speaking, I think there can be a problem, since atheist has come to have this totally strong negative connotation in our culture today. Oftentimes people think that an atheist is by definition dogmatic, rigid, and hostile to non-believers. It's hard to come up with specific data because people are wary of admitting this sort of thing. You know, imagine the telephone rings and somebody says, hi, this is the government. We're doing a survey. Do you believe in God? Say, well, gee, what would be the most politic thing to say here? The most recent data that I have found suggests that about 12 to 15% of Americans consider themselves some form of non-believer, although very few actually self-identify specifically as atheists. That number ranges from about 3 to 5%. So coming up with some other term than atheist, which makes people think of this, there is no God, it might help us to mitigate some problem. I want it to be possible for someone to say, I don't believe in God, or even to say there is no God, and have those statements accepted as reasonable positions that can be held by reasonable people, not people like that. It's always a struggle, I know, to find neutral terms about contested cultural concepts, and we have to keep redefining the terminology. I mean, in the past, it was not considered an insult to refer to people as imbeciles, morons, and idiots. Those were just medical categories referring to intelligence level. Those became too negative and were replaced with terms like mentally retarded, which was the sort of acceptable term when I was a kid. And now that has become, calling somebody a retard was an insult when I was a kid. And that has been changed now. One of my friend's sons is in the 5th grade, and the children there are called special needs as a neutral term. But that's going to go because, unfortunately, the little kids say, he's an SN. Special needs has already gotten that negative connotation. But it's important to try to come up with sort of neutral terms that can express what we want to express. So that raises the issue of what term should we use then if atheist and agnostic are culturally problematic? I wish I had an answer, but I don't really. One possibility is to use non-believer as the most neutral term, but this is problematic because it conflates all the categories into one huge catch-all, and it would incorporate those people who have a very carefully thought-out philosophical position of non-belief and those people who just never think about it at all, you know, who just go about their daily secular lives without worrying about it. Another problem is that non-believer conflates those categories of making metaphysical truth claims, God exists or God doesn't exist, versus making epistemological claims, about how do we know. So saying non-believer is by no means a perfect solution, and it may not be a solution at all. So I'd be interested in your ideas, but I think the terminology is interesting because I want to get away from that idea that atheists are by definition anti-religious. And that is, in fact, a question I get a lot from questioners. Aren't atheists by definition anti-religious? My usual response is that it depends on what you mean by anti-religious. If you mean that atheism is anti-religious in the sense that it's the logical opposition of theism, then yes, it is anti-religious in this sense. That's the same sense in which up is anti-down. It's just an opposition. But culturally speaking, when many people say that atheism is anti-religious, they mean that atheists are actively hostile toward religion or that they approach it with animosity or hatred. I think it's very important to counteract this inaccurate description. As you know, the majority of non-believers have no particular antipathy toward religion or anger. I mean, some probably do, just as there are some theists who are hostile to non-believers. But animosity toward religion is not a necessary characteristic of the philosophical position of atheism. Another common question. I've heard it said that atheism is just as much a religion or a religious belief as theism. Is this true? Now, this question is really important to me because it gets at what I said earlier about the problems involved in casting issues of non-belief in religious terms. I talked over this issue with my brother, who belongs to a Roman Catholic religious order and who has a PhD in the philosophy of religion. He's a member of an organization called the Missionaries of the Precious Blood. He's not a priest, he's a brother, so I have the inestimable pleasure of referring to my brother, the brother. And here is what my brother, the brother, says. Says, quote, I believe that atheism is a religious belief in the sense that it is a belief about the existence of God. It's a belief about the status of the divine in the universe. But there I'm talking about atheism in a philosophical sense. That is, you would study arguments for and against God's existence in a philosophy of religion class, for instance. But if you mean religious in the more social sense, something involving sacred text, worship rituals, statements of faith, and so on, then clearly atheism is not a religious belief. And it's in this cultural and social sense that I often address the question, isn't atheism itself a religion? I really want to combat this idea that being a non-believer, whether you are an atheist or agnostic or however you define that being a non-believer represents as much of a spiritual or religious commitment to faith as any Christian, say, or Muslim might hold. I saw an interview recently with a Canadian novelist, Margaret Atwood, where she was talking about religious issues, and the interviewer asked her if she would consider herself an atheist. She said, oh no, I would never go that far, because to be an atheist is just as much an act of faith as to be a theist. I thought, oh Margaret, please, even you, I think it's very important for the thinking believer, the thinking non-believer, to challenge this popular misconception, this idea that an atheistic belief is the same type of belief as religious faith. It is not. And here's an example from a website that I rather like. The website, as you can imagine, there's a lot of wingnut websites out there about atheism. And you might think that one that was called www.infidels.org would actually be one of the wingnut ones, but it's actually very thoughtful. And here is their response to this question. It says, first, it's not entirely clear that skeptical atheism is something one believes in. Secondly, it is necessary to adopt a number of core beliefs or assumptions to make some sort of sense out of the sensory data we experience. Science has a number of core assumptions. For example, it is generally assumed that the laws of physics are the same for all observers, or at least all observers in inertial frames. These are the sort of core assumptions atheists make. If such basic ideas are called acts of faith, then almost everything we know must be said to be based on an act of faith, and the term loses its meaning. I think much of the problem has to do with the misuse of the term faith, and we need to recognize that there are different types of faith. There's a big difference between religious faith and what we might call faith that a particular proposition is true. We might call this epistemological faith, but really I would prefer to leave the word faith out of it entirely because I think that muddies the issue. Most religions define faith as trust in a divine being, or at least in the possibility of entering into a sacred, loving relationship. They don't see faith as being involved with truth values of propositional or evidentiary claims. And I guess I would make an analogy that you don't demand that your partner or significant other gives empirical proof that they love you, because it's not that kind of relationship. It's not an issue of science, not an experiment. And religious people, I think, would say that scientific proof of divine love, or however you want to define God, is a logical error. But that doesn't mean that issues of evidence are irrelevant. It's a mistake to assume, as some atheists do, that religious faith just means you're willing to believe any kind of nutsoid claim without any example. God is human, divine, came down, rose from the dead, no evidence required. It's not really that simple. My brother, the brother, notes that many Catholic philosophers, as well as other theists and atheists too, are evidentialists in that they believe that some kind of supporting evidence, logical or otherwise, is necessary for establishing belief in the existence of divine beings. So it's not that people don't need evidence for religious beliefs, it's just that that evidence does not have to be empirical. And some religious claims do require empirical or historical evidence. I mean, if you make the claim Jesus Christ existed, was a human being on earth, and was crucified, that's going to require some empirical demonstration. But a metaphysical truth claim, like God exists, it's still a truth claim, it just isn't susceptible to empirical evidence. But then this raises an interesting question. Emory and Henry recently had a winter forum on the question of religion in America, and on the Science versus God panel, participants were asked to define religion. And it was interesting, and it raises the question of, does religion require belief in a divine being or beings? And I'm no expert on world religions, and I know that one of my colleagues in the philosophy department, whom I discussed this with, just categorically says no. There's no requirement for a belief in a divine being for a religion. And of course, there are beliefs that we term religious that don't require belief in a divine being. I'm thinking particularly of Buddhism, which does not have a personal God of the sort that we find in the Jewish or Christian or Islamic traditions. So I really can't get in today into the whole question of what is a religion, but I'm not sure, Buddhists notwithstanding, I'm not sure that I would agree with my philosophy department colleague that issues of divinity are not part of religion. I guess I would offer a basic definition to say that a religion is defined by belief in a divine or at least supernatural controlling power, worship of that power, and trust in, as opposed to empirical demonstration of, that power's existence. I'm certainly willing to have this definition challenged or overturned, but the point I want to make in all of this is that atheism is not a religion. It does not require an act of faith in traditional religious terms. And believers who try to cast non-belief in these terms are committing some serious logical fallacies, I think. But if this is too philosophical, imagine the questioner saying, but wouldn't you agree that atheists at least pose some moral dangers? Wouldn't you agree that some form of religious belief is necessary for the existence of a moral society? No. I know that the definitions of moral and religious and the criteria for judging them are very slippery. But if this claim were true, that without some kind of religious belief you could not have a moral society, we should be able to demonstrate that empirically. We would be able to expect that the least religious societies would also be the most immoral ones. They would have the highest rates of theft and murder and other crimes. They would demonstrate the least respect for individual rights or for community or for social justice, social good, however that is defined, and so on. So in the United States, where polls routinely reveal that between 80 and 90% of people believe in God, and more than 60% usually are willing to define themselves as religious, the U.S. should be a moral paradise. And places like the United Kingdom, where only 33% of people call themselves religious, or Japan, where I think it's less than 20%, they should be moral cesspools. But in fact, statistics do not bear this out. By various measures, the societies that define themselves as the least religious, most secular, are Norway, Iceland, Australia, Canada, the UK, Japan, Sweden, Switzerland, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Denmark. But there's very little, if any, corresponding evidence that these societies are among the world's most immoral. Japan, for instance, has one of the lowest crime rates in the world. And most of the cultures I just listed have among the world's lowest murder rates and the world's highest rate of benefits, such as gender equity, access to health care, and so on. In an article in the Journal of Religion and Society called Cross-National Correlations of Quantifiable Societal Health with Popular Religiosity and Secularism in Prosperous Democracies, I love that, Gregory Paul examined the data from 18 developed countries and found, and I'm quoting Gregory Paul, in general, higher rates of belief in and worship of a creator correlate with higher rates of homicide, juvenile and early adult mortality, venereal disease, teen pregnancy. And none of the strongly secularized pro-evolution democracies experience higher levels of measurable dysfunction. Of the United States, Paul says, the strongly theistic anti-evolution South and Midwest have markedly worse rates of homicide, mortality, sexually transmitted disease, youth pregnancy, and marital problems than the Northeast, where societal conditions, secularization, and acceptance of evolution approach European norms. Interestingly, a recent poll in the UK found that 82% of the respondents actually believe that religion does more harm than good. Now, even acknowledging that the validity of some of these measures of religious success, healthcare rates and mortality and that sort of thing, even recognizing that those standards of judgment are open to question and that the statistics themselves could be flawed. I mean, we don't know exactly how the questions on these surveys were raised. It still seems far from obvious that religious belief leads to moral behavior. And I think some people would argue that creating moral behavior is not really what religion is about, but I don't think it's an unreasonable aspect to examine. I think we only have to look at the current state of the world to see that the potentially problematic links between religious belief and social and political and military behavior. Now the questioner's annoyed. Do you really believe that religion makes people worse and not better? Well, I'm always wary of making any kind of direct cause and effect claims. It seems there's pretty clear that there's a correlation between highly religious societies and a high proportion of social ills. But does the first cause the latter? And no, I'm not going to go there. I don't know. Issues of class and poverty are just as significant, it seems to me. The richer the nation, the more able it is to address social ills. So it may be simply that rich nations are able to afford morality defined as social justice and crime rates and health rates and stuff. Maybe if that's morality, it's just more affordable in the rich nation. It's true that secular nations tend to be richer nations, but I'm certainly not going to claim that not believing in God is going to make you richer. So I will content myself with noting only that there's a correlation between high religious belief and social ills. There's no obvious correlation between absence of religious beliefs and immoral society. I make no claims about cause and effect. Questioner. But would you at least agree that it is important for atheists to respect the religious beliefs of others? Well, that's a poser. Speaking personally, I would like to think that I respect most of the believers, if not necessarily the beliefs. And to some extent, of course, I try to respect all individuals, at least in terms of their basic rights, as human individuals. Not that I'm going to respect all their views. But I've been reading some of the current atheist writers, and they do raise some thought-provoking issues. I brought with me today two best-selling books by Sam Harris, The End of Faith, and his second volume, which is kind of a condensed version of The End of Faith, really, Letter to a Christian Nation. And it's just ridiculous that they should have charged $17 for, but it was on sale on Amazon, so. Anyway, now I have some problems with Sam Harris. His tone works against him. His arguments are sometimes fallacious, and you don't even have to be a philosopher to see some of the logical flaws. And another thing that annoys me is that he refuses to use gender-inclusive language. But he has almost convinced me of his most provocative claim, which is that the religious tolerance of moderates and liberals, people like me, I don't know how moderate I am, but I'm certainly liberal, that we can do a lot of harm. And here's his audacious claim from The End of Faith. And as I read it, you will see what I mean about Harris's sexist language. He says, quote, I hope to show that the very ideal of religious tolerance, born of the notion that every human being should be free to believe whatever he wants about God, is one of the principal forces driving us toward the abyss. Now, those of you who know me know that I can sometimes be a little bit of a doomsayer, so you should probably take that into account. But I do think that our country and world are a lot closer to the abyss than we would like to think. And I do think that religious belief is no small part of this problem. So that's why I think it's time for non-believers to stop hiding in the religious closet and start having a few more coming out parties. Not so that we can make school children cry, but so that we can start having important discussions about religion, belief, and politics that we need to have if we're going to avoid those last fatal steps over the world's current cliffs. Thank you.